Stephen, thank you very much for doing this interview.
My pleasure, Jason. It's great to be here, great to be chatting.
And welcome back to Singapore. You seem to be a very regular visitor.
I hope not too regular. I love coming, but you know, you tell me when to stop, because I always enjoy. I have friends here, and I love the food. I love the weather, which not even Singaporeans seem to. The hotter it is, the better it is for me. So I always have a wonderful time.
I do think it's nice, rather than have this kind of coldness at the winter. I do miss the seasons, but it can be terrible, especially for a pianist, I imagine.
It is,
you know, when you have to move the digits.
Yeah, and it's dangerous even, because you need to be warmed up like an athlete. You know, no athlete just starts to either to play tennis or to run, or you need to limber up, and the same with an instrument. And the piano, yeah, you have to get not just the fingers moving, but the wrist loose, the arm loose, the shoulders loose. So, is there anything that you do to help you with that? Do you? I've got some exercises that I do, and I think you just learn. You need about 15 minutes with the piano, really.
And you're here to play all the Beethoven concertos, which I think is a huge feat. I mean, it's something you've must have done a few times in your career already. This is my second. Just your second time. Last week was my first. Wow. Where was that? That was in Hobart, in Tasmania. Right. We did them all there. Again in 3 concerts. It's possible, of course, to do them in 5 concerts, but 3 is probably the best. Yes. 2 is possible. I know that it must be exhausting to do just them in 2 concerts, though, surely. But you know, I find with Beethoven, it's so exhilarating, the music, that I don't feel tired doing it. There are composers wonderful composers I love playing, but there's something about Beethoven which gives back as much as you give out. It's on a sort of level of a psychic energy, if you like, that very few composers are. I mean, if people have often asked if you could describe a composer in 1 word, what would it be? And it's actually quite an interesting test. And I think energy, for me, is Beethoven. I mean, not just fast energy, but the sort of energy that is driving a whole building, the lighting of a whole building. You feel that incredible power in Beethoven, that assertiveness. You know, he will not let you just sit back and let the music drift over you. He's totally pulling you into his world. And I've not yet played any of these concertos where at one point in the concert I haven't had my eyes moistening with tears. Right. Whether it's at the tragic scenario of the second movement of the 4th concerto, where you feel this is an incredible picture of suffering and of overcoming suffering and maybe not quite managing to do so, or whether it's just like our rehearsal today, the joy in the last movement of the Emperor. To me, I just find, I'm going to start tearing up just thinking about it, because I just find it so exuberant that I'm carried up into that world, and I don't feel tired doing it. It just feels an incredible privilege, is a corny thing to say, but it's kind of true. Absolutely. I mean, I saw your rehearsal, and I could really tell that you were absolutely, I'd say you were in the drama of it. And especially how you play is very dramatic. You're not afraid of, if he's asking you for the fortissimo, to kind of burst in and interrupt, or to kind of... Well, that fortissimo is Beethoven's visiting card. Yes, or pianissimo. It's those extremes in Beethoven, isn't it? It's that... I mean, Beethoven is never polite, he's never conventional, but it's never done for the sake of it, you know. He's not just being rude, he just can't help it. And I've met people like that there's a kind of a brusqueness, which they don't mean to be like that. It's just... It's part of their DNA, isn't it? Yeah, totally. And there are extraordinary moments. You talk about the slow movements of the 4th concerto, but there's an extraordinary moment in the slow movement of the 2nd concerto, which he writes con grande espressione at the end. I mean, I just think his slow movements are just absolutely stunning. Even in the piano sonatas, they have this great breadth. Yeah. This I don't know, what is it about them? That's an amazing moment, I think, in that second, because the 2nd concerto was written before his Opus 1 trios, so it doesn't, you know, it's before anything that was published in his lifetime. Although it then was published later, of course, with Opus 19. But it's very much of its time. You hear, of course, Mozart and Haydn, but every now and then something pokes out of Beethoven. You know, something sticking out of his jacket. Oh, yes, that's not Mozart. You know, whether it's the offbeat accents, of course, in the last movement, da 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 da. Mozart would never have written something like that. It would have been lacking in elegance, lacking in refinement. And yes, that moment at the end of the 2nd movement, to me, that almost traces an arc right to the late period. Right. Because what he's doing is
he's not just being expressive. This con gran espressione, which is I don't know any other composer who uses that exactly.
I don't know. I couldn't think of any. Yeah.
But it's the kind of reaching through the sky to the heavens. It's this contemplative quality, this deep meditative thing, which he developed, of course, more and more in the later music. But that is maybe the first example of it in his music, and it's very touching, and it's very simple. It's just an E flat major chord broken up, and then the dominant, and then the dominant chord broken up. It's sort of the simplest thing you could possibly have, but he makes of it something.
It's so intimate. Profound. It's so intimate. It's very suddenly having a very personal conversation, rather than a public conversation.
Yeah.
And it's extraordinary, the similarity of that's the last movement of the second and the last movement of the Emperor as well, this kind of that rhythmic figure.
Yeah.
Da-da-da-da,
yeah,
kind of
landing on the wrong note,
yeah.
Where the sforzando comes where you don't expect it. Again, that's such a Beethoven thing. It's this, all conventional human beings expect this, and then Beethoven says, yes, but what about this? And that's what I think is so thrilling about the music, not just in the violence, but there is violence in Beethoven. There's incredible passion in that way, but it's in the surprise also of the contemplative, of the tender. And this is a brusque, rough man. I tell you, he spat on the floor. He didn't wash. He
kicked people at dinner. Apparently, he just kicks you for no reason.
I mean, this isn't a person that was comfortable to be around. But I think when he is tender, then it's so much more like the slow movement today of the Fifth Concerto. I mean, then it's so moving, because when someone who's not naturally tender turns that on, then you're really touched by it.
And which is your favourite concerto? You must have a favourite out of the five. Is there
one? I like them all for different reasons.
Yeah.
I think the second, I suppose the second is the least great. If we have to number them 5 to 1, that this would be 5. And he thought so too. He was rather disparaging about this piece. But I think, tossing aside everything he wrote after it, it's still a fresh, wonderful piece with so many wonderful, joyous moments. The first is a big stride forward, and you feel this is him really throwing off Mozart and Haydn. The shadow is
using a very simple key, the simplest tonality.
And C major, of course, was very relevant to Beethoven, and C minor throughout his whole life at different periods. In some ways, I find the third the most moving.
Because of its minor, the only one in minor, right?
It's the journey. It's the journey from the darkness of the minor to the wonderful coda of the last one. And then for that slow movement, it is one of the greatest, this incredible. And if non-musicians who are watching this, it's worth looking at the score, because it doesn't sound like it's written. He's written it in a very contracted form, so that you have many lines, because it's a very, very slow semi-quaver beat.
But like all his best pieces, it has that kind of, it's like a cell that just, it's like there's so much in that compactness, isn't there?
The first concerto is him writing great melodies. Beethoven didn't write a lot of good tunes.
He really didn't, did he?
He was exactly what you said with cells. He took these little motives and loved to take the most unpromising material and then make something wonderful out of it. But the first concerto, there are some wonderful tunes in that, in all 3 movements, so that's an exception. But then the fourth is the most unusual, one of the most unusual pieces he ever wrote. He didn't write the same piece again, and the first movement, I think, of the fourth is arguably the greatest movement of the whole cycle. And it's the cycle stretches across his whole life, but it doesn't include the late period, of course. It stops with the fifth. But I think the fourth is almost like a late period piece, because he's doing things in that which he did later. Yeah. And it's also very decorative. Yeah. It's the hardest to play physically.
It's the hardest to conduct, I think, as well.
Yeah, I'm sure.
And from a conductor's point of view, it's very tricky. Yeah.
Because the whole piece, the whole first movement particularly, is to me about improvisation.
Yes.
I mean, it begins with an improvisation. It's kind of not ordinary, but it's got a particular kind of everyday feeling, and then the orchestra, it becomes then in another world, celestial or whatever. And so that is an incredible moment that sets up, I think, the psychology for the whole piece, which is all about, in a way, the orchestra's about pulling it together, the piano's about pulling it apart. And every time the piano comes in, he's trying to break up the rigidity of this dun 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 dee dun dun. There's a coming in with that first cadenza, which is very free, and so it's all about that world.